Planet MEW Podcast.
This is the journey of setting yourself free.
Okay, welcome back to the podcast. So today's episode, I'm doing something a little bit different. So I'm starting to record these visually as well now. So there's video for every podcast from now on. You can find the video on YouTube, or I will be posting it on social media as well. But not just that, I have a different way of approaching the podcast today. I've realized recently that I'm kind of always entertaining 6 themes at once, as in the books I'm reading, the podcasts I'm listening to. And so what I've also realized is that they all kind of intertwine with each other, and they all kind of have a progressive story of how I've kind of, learned from one and that's led me to the next and whatnot. And so what I would like to do is drop a bunch of podcasts, 5 all together at once, that are basically going to be these 5 different themes, which on their own could be respectful podcast episodes, but they all weave together and tell a story. And so I'm going to drop them all together. So the first one is you're only as high as your lower self, which is an idea that I'm entertaining at the moment. So how this came about is I decided that I was going to do an extended water fast, so something longer than 3 days. And I started to do the fast, but then I realized that there were 2 parts of me that were in conflict. There was a part of me that wanted to do the water fast, and there was a part of me that wanted to eat. And so that was really interesting because I started to explore what are these 2 selves? Because the reasons for me wanting to do the water fast was I wanted to it's a spiritual practice and people get a lot of spiritual insights and stuff like that. And so I was really curious. And yeah, I started fasting. And I was okay, so it feels like my higher self wants to fast, but my lower self is the one who's kind of dragging me back and down and stopping me from being able to do this. And so I really started to explore this concept of higher and lower self. So I realized that the lower self was the one who was stopping me from doing the fasting. And then I came up with this theory because I thought about a chain and the saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And I realized that I can only progress so far as my lower self is willing to go. And I'm not judging that part of me because I think there's always going to be a lower self. I think both have to always exist, like the yin and the yang. And so the way I see it is like a scale. There's a scale between the higher and the lower self. And I try to think, well, how can I move that entire scale? And where am I trying to move it to? So I started entertaining this idea. Well, there's a theory that different thoughts and emotions can produce different frequencies. For example, fear is a low vibrational frequency, while gratitude is a higher vibration. And all emotions can be mapped on a scale. And there's actually some science that supports this theory, from quantum physics to neuroscience. Check out the work by Dr. Joe Dispenza if you have an open mind. I think it's really, really interesting. But then, yeah, I started to entertain this idea that perhaps the goal is to move the scale up this range of emotions and thoughts so that my day by day is more full of gratitude and these higher vibrational emotions rather than fear and lust and some of the lower ones. So yeah, just throwing that out. There's an idea. I spoke to my friend Rachel about this, and she said that it might not be so 2D and linear, which is a great point, but it is very fun to entertain. But anyway, so I really wanted to explore this concept of higher and lower self, and I really want to know what has already been written about this. So I did what I do best. I've rabbit holed. Hinduism actually had a fair bit to say on this. They said that the lower self is the ego, which centers on more worldly attachments and self-centered needs. The higher self, on the other hand, is a state of consciousness that is a divine aspect of ourselves, which can be accessed through yoga practices, such as meditation and introspection. And the realization of the higher self is part of spiritual liberation, which they call moksha. Deepak Chopra, I probably said that wrong, has a book called The Higher Self, Getting in Touch with Your Soul. So I read that book, and he had a more slightly Buddhist approach, I would say, where he believes that the higher self is always there and it's a gap between you and your thoughts. That is, the ego or your thoughts is our lower self, while the higher self is the self or the awareness behind the thoughts. So very power of now. Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, he had a really interesting approach on this. He said that there is a human need for the lower self, and he said that we actually have an unconscious desire for death and destruction, which manifests as aggression, self-destructive behaviors such as suicide, and he called this the death drive. And he said that it's rooted in our desires to end the tensions and complexities of life. On the other hand, he theorized that we have the life drive, which is what drives us towards procreation, social cooperation, and survival. I saw another theory that the reason why we have resistance is because there's like a animalistic need to limit our energy expenditure. And so if we can take the path of least resistance, the more energy we can save and the more chance of survival we have as a species. Speaking of resistance, I also read a really great book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. He focused on resistance a lot because he said that when he's doing art, he notices that there's always that resistance. And something that's really interesting that he said is that the more that our goal is aimed towards our higher calling, the more resistance and fear that we will have around that. And I think that's a really interesting and cool tool on how to find your North Star. He also said that resistance loves to rationalize with you. It'll always come up with reasons to stop you from achieving your goals. And sometimes the rationalization is really true, but that doesn't mean you have to listen to it. And he also said that resistance is strongest at the finish line. So obviously there's a lot of limitations with this. I think there's so much written about this topic that I've only just scratched the surface. So there will be a lot of holes in my knowledge. Maybe one day I'll write a You're Only as High as Your Lower Self 2.0 when I've evolved this theory more, which could be like 5 years. But I think this blog is just a caricature of a deeply intrinsic topic. But I do think that it's worth mentioning because I think it's a pretty universal topic that can still be applied to achieving goals and making sure that they are aligned with your true direction. And I think it also begs the question, the whole question of what is the whole point of the journey and what direction are we supposed to move in terms of spiritual growth, So I think there's a bigger question behind that. But yeah, here are some questions that I started to ask myself. What is the lower self in me? How can I be more familiar with it so that I can recognize it when it's leading me through life? How can I challenge it? And so I decided to do a 14-day water fast to see what voices came up and what does that lower self look like in me in really hard situations? How can I notice or identify where that voice is in other parts of my life? And so my next episode is my experience doing a 14-day water fast. This is what I learned and ultimately what stopped me.